Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Kennedy School. I see a lot of students from my class here, which is a good thing. I'm Nick Burns. I'm a professor here at the Kennedy School. I'm also the faculty chair for our Middle East Initiative. I'm very, very pleased to see Hillary Rentisi here. She's the executive director of that initiative. She's the heart and soul of our efforts to understand the Arab world and Israel. We've got a very active program here and a lot of support for it. It's a great pleasure for me to be here to say a word about Diana Buttu and a word about Robert Malley, then I'm going to get off stage and let them take over. Diana has been here for the last 2 years. She was a fellow in our Dubai initiative last year, and we asked her if she would stay this year because she was such a great success as a fellow in helping us think through the complicated terrain of the Middle East. And as someone who's been a negotiator for the Palestinian Authority, who's a lawyer who knows these issues inside and out, she's been of enormous help to us. And I know that on the recent trek that many of our students made to the Palestinian territory, she was a great resource for our students on that trek, and so I want to thank her for that as well. And she has initiated this series this semester, an in-depth look at the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And so I want to thank Diana for that. And I want to thank her for inviting Rob Malley. Rob is one of the great experts in the United States on this issue, and that is not an exaggeration. He was special assistant to President Clinton. We served in the same administration, but I think when I left the White House, Rob was arriving at the White House in the middle of the administration of those 8 years. But he was a really valued advisor to President Clinton. And of course, you know that the Palestinians, Israelis, came as close as they've ever come to a peace agreement at Camp David in 2000, and Rob was a principal figure in those talks and a principal advisor to President Clinton. So we at the Kennedy School obviously want to do what we can to stimulate thought, creativity, innovation, because we need all that in thinking through how the United States can be an effective mediator. We were just talking outside about whether or not the quartet can be successful. Today we had, in my class, Modern Diplomacy, we had Javier Solana, who was our guest speaker, and we had an in-depth talk about the failure of the United States, the European Union, the United Nations, and Russia to be an effective mediator. Now, that doesn't mean that both Israel and the Palestinians don't have their share of responsibility for 64 years, nearly, come this May 14th, of a failed peace negotiation. But in the modern incarnation, we have not been able to be effective. And so one of the questions I would have for Rob would be, how can outsiders in 2012 and looking forward play an effective role as a balancer, as neutral mediators between two respected friends of the United States, the Palestinians and the Israelis? That's a challenge, minor challenge, for Rob today. I just wanted to put in a plug for an event we're having at 6 o'clock. Yours will have ended. And if you all are interested in getting a European view from two senior politicians, I'm going to be interviewing at 6 o'clock in the forum Javier Solana and David Miliband. David's the former foreign secretary in the Labor government. We're going to talk about Israel-Palestine, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the European political crisis. I'll interview them on those 4 subjects for 40 minutes, then we'll turn it over to questions from the audience. So if you're interested, I hope you are, please join us in the forum. But Dan, I just want to thank you for everything you've done for the Kennedy School, the Middle East Initiative. I want to thank Rob for being here. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I'll go up there. Okay. You're going to say something? I'll just start. Thank you, Nick, for those kind words. It's great to be back here, where I spent many years at law school, and it's great to be here to talk about a strange subject at a strange time. The strangest thing of all is that in D.C., if we were talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at this point, we'd probably get 5 people, including my family, and we managed to get close to 70 today, which says something maybe about Cambridge. I say strange conflict because when you think about it, the pedigree of the idea of a two-state solution, when it was first introduced, some 8 decades ago or so, both parties, both Jews and Arabs and Palestinians, were quite reluctant. Jews came to see it as to their benefit, and the Palestinians were very adamant in rejecting it for many, many, many years. By the time in the late 80s, when Yasser Arafat, after having gone through many different incarnations, came to accept the notion of a Palestinian, instead of a two-state solution, it was then Israel that was adamant in its rejection. When President Clinton put his parameters on the table, when I was working for him in the year 2000 to try to resolve the conflict along the two-state solution, the Israelis were the first to accept it. The Palestinians did not. Several years later, Yasser Arafat said that in fact he had accepted it. At that point we had an Israeli prime minister who didn't want to hear a word about them. We find it at this stage we're at a point where the international community, virtually as a whole, unanimously, whether it's the Arabs, the Israelis, the Americans, the Europeans, have endorsed and accepted the two-state solution, the notion of a Palestinian state living side by side with Israel, precisely at the time when the parties themselves, and most of all the Palestinians, seem to have lost both interest and faith in the idea. And that's only one of the paradoxes. The other paradox is that we now have at the head of the Palestinian movement the man who's been most identified with the notion of negotiating with Israel that the Palestinians have ever had, President Abbas. From the very beginning, his job among Palestinians was to reach out to Jews and to Israelis in particular. And yet he is the Palestinian leader who seems to be least interested in returning to negotiations, even though, at least in principle, the party has most to gain from negotiations and from resolving this conflict and from ending the status quo are the Palestinians. And the party, or the person, Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli Prime Minister, who in principle would have most to fear from negotiations, which sooner or later would expose the big yawning gap between his position and that of the American administration. And yet he's the leader who seems to be most eager to return to the talks. As for the United States, which says virtually every day that they can't want peace more than the parties themselves, well, President Obama and his team seem to be showing every day that that's not the case through their eagerness to get the talks resumed. Second set of paradoxes that seem to bedevil this conflict is that the most significant progress that has been made, not just between Israelis and Palestinians, but between Israelis and Arabs, seems to occur not through negotiations, but through unilateral steps. Focus on the Israeli-Palestinians. The big events since Oslo, the withdrawal from Gaza, the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, the steps that the Palestinian Authority has been taking, which people celebrate, particularly in the U.S., as revolutionary, the steps that Prime Minister Fayyad has been taking to build institutions, to create a virtual Palestinian state, has been taken not as a result of negotiations, but in the absence of negotiations. One of the more significant Israeli settlement freezes, and it comes with a lot of caveats, it was not a full freeze, it was not a full moratorium, but one of the most significant ones took place under Netanyahu's watch. Not again as a result of negotiations, but when no negotiations were taking place. And the third paradox has to do with the role of the U.S., the one that Nick just asked me about. Look at the major breakthroughs between Arabs and Israelis. Sadat's visit to Jerusalem, the Israeli-Jordanian peace agreement, or even the Oslo agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. For each one of those, the U.S. only came in at the end, not to jumpstart the process, not to make sure that things happened, but to make sure that they crossed the finish line. So all of which begs three questions, simple questions. What's wrong with the two-state solution? What's wrong with negotiations? And what's wrong with the U.S.? There's some easy answers that people tend to give. What's wrong with the two-state solution? People would say, well, what's gone wrong is that we never had the right alignment of stars. You either had too weak an Israeli prime minister, or too weak a Palestinian president, or too militant a Palestinian president, or too preoccupied a U.S. administration, or uninterested U.S. administration. Prime Minister Rabin was killed just before he was going to reach an agreement with the Palestinians. Prime Minister Sharon was victim of a stroke just before he was about to complete a withdrawal from the West Bank. So the first explanation, a bit like the old communists who would say that communism would work in practice but it hadn't worked yet because they only had bad examples up until then, are those people who would say the two-state solution is only a right alignment of stars away from being realized. That's sort of one school of thought, one answer to these various paradoxes. The second is to say the two-state solution simply is unrealistic. It's not the right solution to this conflict. And we're hearing more and more these days, and I think Diana knows it very well, talk about perhaps a one-state solution, a You can't have two states. The reason it hasn't succeeded is not because you didn't have the right people, you didn't have the right strength of characters, you simply had a problem of what the objective itself was. So you got to throw that objective away and redefine it completely by going back to the notion of a single binational, perhaps, state. And the third answer to this problem of the failure of the two-state solution, the failure of negotiations, and the failure of the U.S. is to say the only way to resolve this is by having a third party, but not the kind of third party we've had so far. You need either a U.S. that's going to be prepared to impose a solution, be much more forceful, impose sanctions on Israel, threaten Israel with all kinds of punishment, and impose a solution. And if the U.S. is not prepared to do that, then the international community the U.S. should butt out, and you should have the United Nations or some other constellation of countries that would come in and impose a solution to both parties, which is really code word in most cases for saying impose it on the Israelis. Those who are familiar with what I've written, and I think Diana distributed or posted some of what I wrote with my colleague Hussein Aga, might be familiar with our intellectual journey, which has basically been a journey to try to answer these questions. I can't say we've succeeded. I think we've succeeded in raising the right questions, and we're still several steps away from getting an answer. But let me try in the minutes that I have left to answer my view about what's wrong with the two-state solution, what's wrong with negotiations, and what's wrong with the U.S., and try to say what I don't think is going to happen, and then offer some pathways of where we might move in the future. So what have I learned through my years in the Clinton administration and since about what I think will not work and why I think some of these explanations I just gave are not the right ones? The first one, which I said, was you just have to have the right alignment of the stars. Well, the first answer is to say we're never going to get it. I mean, the ideal solution where you're going to have the right Israeli Prime Minister, the right Palestinian President, the right American administration, the right Arab configuration of country that's prepared to take the risks for peace. Maybe that would help, but we're never going to get there, so what's the point? Besides, we really have gone through over the last almost 20 years all kinds of configurations. We've had a strong Palestinian leader, a militant one, that who had the legitimacy and the credibility to convince his people to make concessions in the person of Yasser Arafat. We also had a Palestinian president who was moderate, pragmatic, who seemed to understand the need to reach out to the other side in the person of Mahmoud Abbas. We had strong Israeli prime ministers, such as Ariel Sharon in the past, or Benjamin Netanyahu today, in terms of their capacity to speak for the Israeli right wing. We also had more moderate, some would say perhaps more pragmatic, if that's the word, Israeli prime minister, whether it was Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Olmert. So we've had that kind of configuration as well. And we've also had times when the Arab world was prepared to be militant against Israel, times when it would reach out, as with the Arab Peace Initiative, where it proposed a deal whereby if Israel were to withdraw from all of the territories, there would be full recognition and full normalization with Arab countries. We've had times when we've had U.S. presidents that were extremely involved, such as President Clinton when I was working for him, or President Barack Obama. And we've had other times when the U.S. took the view, as President Bush Jr. did, at least in his first term, that the U.S. should stay out for a bit and not push it too far. All of these configurations have existed, and none of them has yet yielded the breakthrough that people are waiting for. So this notion that it's just a matter of tinkering, of finding the right person at the right time, or today people say, let's wait for Netanyahu to be defeated in an election and have a left-wing government in Israel take place, a center-left government. We've had those center-left governments. And by the way, when Prime Minister Olmert was Prime Minister, not only did we not achieve an Israeli-Palestinian peace, but there were two Arab-Israeli wars. So it's not clear to me that that's the distinction that matters. In fact, you could make the case, as I was suggesting earlier, that if ever there was a time where you would have a chance to reach an agreement, it's when you have an Israeli Prime Minister who has the credibility, the strength, to carry with him the vast majority of Israelis. Because if Netanyahu were to sign off on a deal, one can imagine not just that his partisans would be with him, but of course the center and the left would be with him as well. So this notion that that's what's missing seems to me to be the wrong one, and those people who are waiting for the right person to emerge in one place or another seem to me to be wasting their time. I don't think the one-state solution is an answer either. First of all, I think one-state solution is an oxymoron. A solution means that both sides agree with it. That's the sine qua non for a solution. Israeli Jews will not, at least not in my lifetime, I suspect not in your lifetime, come to terms with the notion that the Zionist enterprise, the notion which was to create a state for the Jewish people, that would be put aside in favor of a binational state, which, by the way, is very unclear to me how that resolves any of the issues that a two-state solution is supposed to resolve any more easily. You still have to decide on basic issues such as what happens with the refugees, what is the precise status of Jerusalem. You might even have to deal with issues of security. You might even have to deal with the issue of boundaries if you're going to do it in sort of a community division of the country. And the very reason why two-state solution doesn't work, or one of the reasons, which is the gap between Israelis and Palestinians, the lack of trust, the conflictual relationship between the two. How on earth can one imagine that those are going to disappear in some kind of ideal one-state solution? So from a moral, ethical point of view, you could make a very cogent argument as to why it would be nicer to have a state that is not based on ethnic identification and in which everyone could live in a democratic, binational or democratic state in which all citizens are equal. It simply seems to me to be pure fantasy. And again, it's oftentimes used more as a tactic to try to scare the Israelis than as a genuine objective. But I'm sure that we could have a discussion on that, but that's certainly a conviction that I've reached. So the notion that you throw away the two-state solution and you think of another one seems to be off base. Third idea, which is this notion, the U.S. The U.S. has to be more forceful. The U.S. has to come in and impose a solution. And there some people are hoping, and I had this discussion right before the session, that a President Obama in a second term might do what he wasn't able to do in the first term and be much more forceful in making sure that a solution occurs on his watch. A few comments. First, I think if you look at President Obama in the first 2 years, well, he wasn't really constrained by fears of not being reelected, fears of alienating certain interest groups in Washington. He didn't succeed, if anything. I mean, if you look at, here's a president who came in with the best of intentions, and I certainly supported those intentions. But after now 3 years plus, he's ended up distrusted by Palestinians, distrusted by Israelis, and with the U.S. having less authority, not even being able to bring the parties together, less authority than his predecessors had. That's not necessarily, it's not entirely his making, but at least it should tell us something about the ability of the U.S. over the years to achieve what it wants. And the notion that you would have a president who could actually come in and impose a solution, sanction Israel, put pressure on Israel, one would have to be divorced from basic rules of politics in the United States to imagine that could happen. I would also question whether you really could have a U.S. administration that could force Israel to do something that it profoundly believes is against its interests. I'm not sure that could happen, but if it could happen, I think it would take a degree of pressure that no president, not President Obama, not President Romney, not President Kucinich, no president could do and still be viable in the political environment. So the faith that I sometimes hear Palestinians have, we're waiting for that president who's going to come in and do for us what we haven't been able to do for ourselves. I think that's another myth that needs to be discarded, because it's also a myth that's been extremely costly, leading the Palestinians to put their faith in the hands of others who have never delivered for them. Which brings us really to the point, again, Nick raised the question, is there a more effective international role, even if it's not the U.S.? There certainly has to be a more effective international role than the one we've seen so far. I mean, if you look at the balance sheet of what the international community has done, not just the United States, the Europeans, the Arabs, it's been almost entirely negative, and I am exaggerating slightly for effect. But what it's done, in my view, is that it's produced a system of addiction to a process that doesn't yield any results. The Europeans are very happy being in the position of funding a Palestinian Authority, financing an occupation. I mean, let's call it for what it is, which is a way of perpetuating it at low cost. The Americans have been there to provide this sense of false hope to the Palestinians, skewing their own sense of the balance of power, believing that somehow the balance of power was more in their favor than it actually is, because they thought they had the U.S. on their side, which they never have had and won't have. And obviously it's given a lot of cover also for Israel to do what it wanted to do. So basically, the way the U.S. and the Europeans and others have been involved in this conflict, if anything, has served to perpetuate it rather than to solve it. But again, the notion that you might somehow have an international community that could act in radically different ways. Forget about its support for the Palestinian Authority. Forget about its ties to Israel, and strategic and otherwise. And try to do in Israel what it hasn't been able to do in most places in the world. I mean, there are not that many cases, I would submit, where sanctions have succeeded in changing the outlook of a group in power that believes that its policies are critical to its national interest. The one case people always bring up is South Africa, which really is the exception that proves the rule. And if you speak to South African leaders today, leaders from the apartheid period, and you ask them, were the sanctions really what made you move, they say no. And so this notion that you could get through sanctions the Israeli public and the Israeli leadership to move seems to me to be quite quixotic. And given the character of the Jewish people, the Jewish Israelis, the first reflex they would have if they saw, as they're seeing now through BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and other forms of pressure, their first reaction is not, my God, we have to do something to reach out to the international community. It's to hunker down and to think this validates the very point we've always made. We can only count on ourselves. The international community has never really bought our existence, has never really accepted our legitimacy. This simply proves the point we've tried to make from the beginning, and therefore we have to be even more tough in terms of how we defend our interests. So where does that leave us if we don't have the solution of tinkering on the margins? And by the way, to add one word on that, it's not just the failure of the two-state solution negotiations, as I said, of which I was a part for several years, and where we thought we were this close, but in hindsight really weren't. It's not simply, the answer is not simply, well, you have to get the right cast of characters. As I've said, I think that's the wrong answer. The other reflex is to say, we just have to try a little bit harder. We're not quite there. Maybe we didn't get the quite equation when it came to the territorial dimension or Jerusalem. That also seems to me, I was a believer in that. I've said for many years, we know what the outcome is. It's simply a matter of convincing the parties to get there. Well, if after so many years of knowing what the solution is, you can't get the parties to get there, maybe you start asking yourself the question of whether that solution is really the one that the parties are prepared to accept. And I asked myself this following question. To get President Abbas and Prime Minister Netanyahu to agree on something today would mean, along the lines of what we negotiated at Camp David, or what was negotiated in Tabo, what was negotiated by Prime Minister Olmert and President Abbas, would mean that one side or the other would have to agree to something that his predecessor, or himself in the case of President Abbas, adamantly rejected only a few years ago. Prime Minister Netanyahu would have to go further than Prime Minister Olmert went, and he accused Prime Minister Olmert of having gone way too far. And or President Abbas would have to accept something today that he rejected when Prime Minister Olmert put it to him. I mean, at this point, and I'm at the age where I'm beginning to feel quite clearly what it means to be arthritic, I would say the peace process has become arthritic. There's no more room to maneuver along in the paradigm that has been defined in the past. One side is going to lose, and if one side loses, it simply can't sustain it politically. So, I've given you all the bad news. Can I give you any good news about what might come next? I'm just going to go through a series of scenarios of what I think are the most likely outcomes. And the final one will be not the most likely, but I would say the most hopeful. The most likely outcome is a continuation of the status quo, at least for the time being. I was a little bit tickled. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, maybe a year or two ago, said the status quo is unsustainable. She then hastened to add, I don't mean that that's not sustainable for a year, or 2 years, or 10 years, or 30 years, but at some point it's not sustainable. If you think that Israelis and Palestinians right now are thinking 30 years hence, then you're kidding yourselves. They're thinking year by year, and year by year, it is sustainable, the proof being that it has been sustained. It's a reality on the ground, with modifications that take place, with crises that take place, but ultimately it's been sustainable for a number of reasons having to do, first and foremost, with the asymmetric balance of power between Israelis and Palestinians. Now, I do agree that there's a problem at the core of this status quo, which is the occupation of another people, and usually people don't accept that status for a long period of time. The Palestinians right now seem to be in a mode of exhaustion, understandable after the Second Intifada. Also, as they started to see some economic progress, they didn't want to jeopardize it. But if things continue, I would say you do have the risk of renewed violence, and you also have, from an Israeli perspective, the risk of growing international condemnation, perhaps even isolation. If the Israelis are smart, they would then go for what I would call the second option, which is another unilateral action of their own. What are the threats that people say the Israeli Jews face? It's the threat of international condemnation and isolation, and it's a demographic threat. The notion that over time, the number of Arabs living between the river and the sea will exceed the number of Jews, and at that point Israel will start looking more and more like an apartheid state because it will deny the right to vote of those non-Jews. I'm not sure why the tipping point is exactly 50%. I mean, is it far less acceptable if they're 51% Arabs and if they're 30% Arabs? So I'm not sure that the demographic threat, even in its purest form, really makes sense. But it also assumes that Israel has no asset at its disposal to face what is a long-term but growing threat, if you want to view it as a threat. But, by the way, I also find the word threat, which is used by the Israeli left even more than the Israeli right, I find it quite noxious, the notion that the growth of any national group would be viewed as a demographic threat. I find that's not the best way to look at things, but if you do look at it that way, Israel has answers. It had one answer already by withdrawing from Gaza. 1.5 million Palestinians, from an Israeli point of view, no longer a part of the equation. That buys them many, many years. They could do the same in parts of the West Bank. They could withdraw from areas of the West Bank that are heavily populated by Palestinians, holding on to what they want to hold on most, the area closest to the 67 border and the Jordan Valley. By doing that, they would score several goals. Number one, they will reduce, at least for some time, any international pressure, because they could say, look, we took a step at a time when the Palestinians are not even prepared to negotiate with us. We withdrew from more territory. We did it again. We did it without recompense. We did it because we felt it was in our interest, but it also serves the Palestinians, who can now govern themselves more freely. And more to the point, for those who believe that demography is what's going to push the Israelis, they could say, well, now we've gotten rid of, just take a figure out of a hat, another 1.5 million Palestinians. At that point, the notion of a demographic balance ceases to exist, and Israel can have answered both those questions. So that's scenario number two, which may seem quite unrealistic today because the Israelis feel like they've had extremely negative experiences when they withdrew from Gaza unilaterally or from Lebanon, South Lebanon unilaterally. In both cases, they say it was reciprocated. The withdrawal was reciprocated by a barrage of missiles. So it's not a very popular concept, but I suspect that over time, number one, memories will recede. Number two, Israel's anti-missile defense system will have reached the point where they will feel more secure, and they may find other ways of securing their defense. It wouldn't be a full withdrawal. So I think that could be a second scenario. A third scenario, if the status quo prevails, there's not this step, and the conditions remain as they are, is an eruption of violence. I mean, there's been a major or significant Israeli-Arab war virtually every 7 years for the last 60. So one could assume that we're due for one, and it could very well come from the Palestinian territories, whether Jerusalem, which is a real powder keg, from Gaza, or from the West Bank. Again, I don't see it in the cards right now, but it is something that certainly, if I were an Israeli planner or Palestinian or American planner, I would think that it is at least possible. It doesn't necessarily mean that after that things change radically. You could have a war and then come back more or less to the status quo ante, but it is at least a third scenario for the future, which is not, by the way, inconsistent with the first two. And then I come to the fourth, which is the one that Hussein Aga and I have spent the most time thinking about, which is there another way, assuming, as I do, that the one-state solution is not a solution, assuming, as I do, that there will not be international imposition, and assuming, as I do, that the notion is not simply tinkering on the margins on a process that has been exhausted and for which there are now negative marginal returns each time you go back to the table and try to negotiate on the basis of the Clinton parameters or the Taba semi-agreement. Assuming all that, is there a different way of defining the solution, which is still a two-state solution, but which is different and which one would go about differently from the way people have gone about it in the past. And here all I could do, the best I can do, and I can't claim to have more answers than what I'm going to give now, is to put some elements on the table. One of the things that it strikes me had the two-state solution a la Clinton did not address all the basic issues that are at the origins, at the genesis of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Well, those parameters, and for those of you who are not familiar with them, what they did is basically say we're going to divide the territory along more or less the 1967 lines. We're going to divide Jerusalem according to demographic lines. The right of return for Palestinian refugees, we're just going to sort of give some kind of token answer that they could have a choice, but the one choice they won't have is returning to Israel. And that's about it. What it didn't address was what sparked the conflict in the first place, 1948. The notion that you could resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this existential conflict that mixes not just territory, but religion and culture and history and conflicting narratives, simply through basically a territorial solution based on the 1967 conflict, and erasing everything that came before. Not only does that seem counterintuitive, but when you look at the behavior of the parties, particularly over the last several years, it also goes against what they're telling us. What has Prime Minister Netanyahu been insisting upon time and again for the last 2 or 3 years? That Palestinians recognize Israel as a homeland of the Jewish people or as a Jewish state. Now we could argue for hours whether that is purely whether he did this because he knew the Palestinians would reject it and therefore it was a great way to prevent any negotiations from going forward. And maybe. I wouldn't exclude that's at least part of it. But it was effective, and it was effective because it resonates extremely widely with all Israel, or the vast majority of Israeli Jews, for whom that's the core of the question. Can we be accepted as the homeland of the Jewish people because we are nothing else? We're not simply another state. The whole purpose of our state was to be the state that Jews would build, that Jews would govern and feel secure within. And if Palestinians are not prepared to accept that, then it's true that at some level, Israel will feel the conflict has not been ended. If they don't accept us as a Jewish state, that means that at some point they will call it into question either themselves directly, or the refugees, or Palestinian citizens of Israel. So they see this possibility of a continuing bleeding conflict if they don't shut it down and say, it's the end of the conflict, you recognize us as a legitimate Jewish state, homeland of the Jewish people. From the Palestinian point of view, the genesis of the conflict, before 67, before the notion was of building a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, is the refugee issue. That's, the PLO is a movement for refugees. Yasser Arafat is a refugee. Mahmoud Abbas is a refugee. That's what was the motor, the impetus for the Palestinian national movement was the return of refugees. And all of the solutions that people have been talking about give it short shrift. And I was the first guilty. We proceeded, and still today people proceed under the assumption that's just a card the Palestinians are playing. They'll be prepared to give it up the day they get everything else they want, or more or less what they want. But that's, one of my colleagues when I was working in the Clinton administration told me years after that the main mistake we made, we Americans, was that we didn't respect the issues enough. These are not simply cards that they were trading. This was a sacred issue for Palestinians. And you see it more and more because as Israel is insisting on recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, Palestinians are, number one, more and more adamant that they will reject it, and more adamant that there needs to be some recognition, we could debate what, of the right of return and of the injustice that was inflicted upon the refugees. So the first sort of hint of suggestion of going forward is to try to redefine what it is we're trying to solve, and try to inject elements that are going to go to the core of the issue. Elements of recognition of Jewish legitimacy, not just of Jewish attachment to the land, but of a state that they would call their own and in which they would feel that they would be exercising their right to self-determination. Some form of justice and acknowledgement of what happened to the refugees, and not simply saying, well, they were victims of a war and now we're going to resettle them in different countries and give them some money and that would be the end of that. So is there a way to inject these issues so that rather than the arthritic process I spoke about earlier, you're putting new elements in it so that both sides can have a win they didn't have before? New ideas, but also new constituencies. The peace process so far has been built around the people who are most likely to endorse it. And the people who've been excluded are those who've been most likely and who've proven themselves most willing to torpedo it. So you have Islamists and refugees, the diaspora on the Palestinian side, who've never really been part of the equation. Even though they're more motivated, they have a greater incentive and greater ability to wreck the process if they want to. But they've not been part of it. Their issues have not been addressed. They've not been addressed as people. And on the Israeli side, settlers and the religious community have been more integrated, but still their issues have not been as front and center at the table. Issues such as recognition of Jewish attachment to the land, recognition of a Jewish homeland, what kind of security they would need, what would happen to the settlers, are there solutions for the settlers other than their evacuation? So is there a different way to define who's at the table? And then finally, is there a different way to think of the international architecture? As I said earlier, what we've been doing so far has been relying either on the U.S. or on the Quartet. And the Quartet, Russia, the United Nations, the United States, and the European Union, has been a least common denominator organization that, again, I think has done its best, not wittingly, but unwittingly has done its best to perpetuate the status quo. Has silenced voices that might, in fact, have more creative ideas, all for the sake of being at the table. I mean, I think the Europeans and the Russians were so ecstatic at the notion that finally they were invited to the party, they didn't really care what the party was about to begin with. And if we continue with this kind of model, this kind of architecture, it's very unlikely that we're going to get anywhere. I don't have an answer to what international architecture that could be. I don't have an answer to how you change one of the major obstacles to movement, which has been, as I said earlier, the lack of incentive on the Israeli side. And this is not a matter of being a bad faith. If any one of us were in Netanyahu's shoes, you'd think, what is in it for me to take the political risk that it will be entailed by going to a two-state solution, doing whatever I have to do to alienate some parts of my constituency, when the status quo is not that bad to begin with. The economy is flourishing, security-wise things aren't that bad. Yes, we had some hiccups with the international community, but as we saw, Netanyahu managed to deal with his relationship with President Obama and the U.S. quite well. Is there a way to change that structure by giving greater incentives? I mentioned, can we redefine what a two-state solution could look like? Are there other incentives in terms of security so that Israel is not simply feeling that it's reaching a deal with the Palestinians? What kind of security, regional security architecture could we think about? And are there things that Palestinians could do? Something that they could do to sort of shake things up, whether it has to do with nonviolent popular resistance, whether it has to do with unification, because I can't imagine the Palestinians are ever going to achieve their goals if they're divided. I don't know in the history of national liberation movements, of the national liberation movement that's crossed the finish line when it was as deeply divided as this one. Usually they either unite or one side crushes the other. But divided this way, they're not going to get where they want. And I think that's something that the international community needs to understand, that Palestinian unity is not an obstacle, but a precondition for moving forward. So are there different ways of thinking? Also rethinking the PA, the Palestinian Authority's role, its functions. What does it do? I mean, for many Palestinians are saying now, we're simply an arm of the occupation. We're doing for Israel what Israel as an occupying power should do for itself. Again, we're perpetuating, we're one of these other elements that is contributing to this addiction to the peace process. Can it be rethought? Dismantling it could be very costly for those many Palestinians who rely on it for their survival. But are there other ways of redefining what it would do? So as I say, these are just, at this point, ideas, but I think it's better, given where we are, given 18 years of consistent, repeated, systematic failure, isn't it better to think of these new ideas, however illusory some may turn out to be, than to continue stubbornly along the paths that we've traveled in the past, and talking about the U.S., at America's peril, because it loses credibility each time it fails, and at the Israelis and the Palestinians' expense. Thank you, and I guess we'll take some questions.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thanks for joining us here at the Kennedy School. The topic is the conversation series is called Can the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict Be Resolved? And it sounds from what you're saying, perhaps it can be, but if we start changing our mode of operating. Thank you very much for coming today. I have to say, because Nick actually introduced you, that what I was going to say in the introduction is that it's always been sobering to hear you. And what I also want to share with the audience is that Rob is always the person, I think, that was respected equally by both the Israelis and the Palestinians for very sobering analysis, very thoughtful, and also thought-provoking. So thank you for joining us today. Rob, so I wanted to just touch a little bit further on some of the issues that you raised and then open it up for questions, which is, given that we're now in this period of an election that is about to happen, it sounds from what you were saying that there is not going to be any real change in U.S. policy towards Israel and towards the Palestinians for a very long period of time, at least from the United States. And given that this is the configuration, given that we're seeing that more and more settlements are being built, etc., what is it that we should be expecting, if anything, from now until at least past the election period?
Well, I think between now and the election period, don't expect anything. I think that I'm not breaking any news. Listen, I think President Obama, my sense of him is that he's deeply frustrated by what happened. It's not what he wanted to happen, and deep down, I suspect if he could, he would want to act differently in the second administration if he has a second term. I'm not excluding that he'll try. My message is, and it's mainly a message to those Palestinians and some Israelis as well, who are harboring the hope that in his second reincarnation he will be not just very different, but also more effective. If it happens, great. I'll be the first to applaud. But don't place your faith on that. And when I hear Palestinians saying, well, there's some things we can't do now because we have to wait for Obama to be, there's no historical evidence that that's going to be the case. And again, if you look at Obama, Palestinians tend to rejoice at moments of when there's difficult relations between Israel and the U.S., and then they bemoan the periods of closeness between the two. Mainly, for the most part, if you look historically, periods of tense relations between Israel and the U.S. are simply a precursor to an attempt by the U.S. to get them warm again. And that's certainly what happened with President Obama. He had a period of fwada with Prime Minister Netanyahu. He learned his lesson, and then he did everything he could to restore, to the extent he could, the relations to what they had once been. Again, I don't want to predict that he's not going to try differently, but I'd give two reasons why. Again, as I said, I think it would be a mistake to bank on it. One, as I said, because there's no historical evidence, and that what it would take for the president not just to be different, but be different in a way that actually makes a difference. What is he going to do? Is he going to start really pressuring Israel and threatening adverse consequences? He still is going to have to deal with a political climate in the U.S. which would find that completely off-bound. But beyond that, I think one of the lessons Obama learned from the first time is not just Bibi is a difficult person to deal with, and he may have learned that, I think, but that the whole situation is a mess, and it's much harder. He said himself, much harder than I ever anticipated. His impressions of President Abbas today are not particularly positive. He feels like he went out on a limb, and I'm not taking his offense in this, but he feels he went out on a limb, tried to help President Abbas by putting his ideas on the table, and President Abbas is not prepared to go back to negotiations. As I said, the first time since Arafat that a Palestinian president is not prepared to go to negotiations is imposing conditions at a time when, from Obama's point of view, he's the most, quote-unquote, sympathetic president to the Palestinians have ever had. So he doesn't really have great affection for Abbas. He doesn't have great trust in the way the Palestinian political system is working. He believes at this point that every time they want to take a step, they're afraid of the shadows because of political constraints. They're too divided. They're never going to take the risk. If you were advising, I was asking one of the members of the audience, if you were advising Obama tomorrow, yes, you should get reinvested. Okay, I know I should do it because I believe in it. What would you do? How would you get these parties together? Some of the ideas I put on the table, I think ideas he should consider. But those too are political dynamite. Changing America's position when it comes to Hamas-Fatah's relationship, changing America's role and what issues we put on the table, what parties it's prepared to talk to, Islamists, the diaspora, and others. Those are things that are going to be hard. Each one of those are going to be hard with a a very uncertain benefit in the end. So I'd be the first, as I said, to be applauding if you were in fact to come back smartly, because I think the way you did it last time, we discussed it, I think it was one tactical mistake after another. If you were to do it smartly, yes, but again, my main message, and it's mainly to the Palestinians, but also to others, it's not a strategy to hope that that's going to happen.
So the other question that I had, Rob, was what about the role of Iran, if there is a role for Iran, in terms of, not necessarily the role for Iran, but what if Israel decides that it is going to unilaterally hit Iran, if it's going to bring the United States on board? Is that at all going to change anything in the coming period?
We got to discuss about whether I think it's likely or not. I think, just very shorthand, I think the odds of an Israeli unilateral strike on Iran in 2012 have been reduced significantly, in large part thanks to what the administration did. I think the odds of an American strike against Iran in 2013 may have increased appreciably because of the commitments that President Obama felt compelled to make in order to sort of restrain Israel this year by taking the whole notion of containment off the table, by making clear that the U.S. would be prepared to attack militarily. I think those are the kinds of things that may come back to haunt Obama, assuming he doesn't want to strike, but may find that he has caught himself and put his own back against the wall. I don't know that it has going to have a huge impact on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, other than to put it even lower down the totem pole of priority. I mean, it is remarkable that you've had, and as I said, it's surprising to see so many of you here because nobody is talking about this issue in Washington. It really doesn't matter. People are tired of being tired of it. If they reach that point, I think our Palestinians could think about it still. I mean, it's the person who works for me on Israeli-Palestine is here, Rob Ledger, and we're talking over at lunch, and he's desperate to find something else to work on because it really has become almost unbearable. So I think if that happens, there'll be some voices that will say, now that we have Israel's attacked Iran, and so it's caused, or America's attacked Iran, and it's caused this backlash against Israel and the U.S. Now is the time to move out the Palestinian conflict because that's where you're going to restore credibility. And I say this with a lot of sympathy because usually they're my friends. Whatever happens, they will say, now this is why resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is more critical than ever. When the Arab Spring happened, and you had changes in Egypt, and possibly tomorrow in Jordan, and instability throughout Syria and throughout the region, you had two schools of thought. The people who felt that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict shouldn't be dealt with, mainly the Israeli right wing, said, this proves our point, the region is unstable, how could we think of making concessions to the Palestinians when we don't even know who's going to be in power in Amman and Cairo tomorrow? That was they didn't budge. And the other side, as I said, people who I usually am in agreement with said, now that there's all this commotion, the Islamists are coming, now is the time when we absolutely have to stem the hemorrhage by reaching an Israeli-Palestinian deal. They would have said that if there was an Arab Spring, if there was an Arab Winter, if there was anything, I think these issues are really marginal. At this point, there is a more sort of secular trend, which is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is taking, is more and more being pushed to the margins. That will change, sad to say, only if you have a new explosion there, which is not advice to the Palestinians. I'm just a statement of fact that the only way it's going to gain attention is to have a new crisis there. But other than that, crises around the region, you're going to see some people arguing this is all the more reason not to do anything, and others, the same ones who said it before, will say all the more reason for us to be active.
So, any questions? If you could just state your name and affiliation.
Yes, Ahmed Moore, master's student, first year at Kennedy School. So you sort of alluded to it a few times. Can you comment more directly on the role of the Israel lobby, particularly when it came to educating the president about the real dynamics on this issue in Washington? Is there any way to reclaim American agency, at least in the Middle East?
Well, I mean, that's a loaded question, the way you put it. I don't subscribe to the notion that the reason why the U.S. has not been affected because of the Israel lobby. I think it's dishonest to say that they don't play a role. They certainly play a role, and we see it on display at least, much more than once a year, but certainly at the time of the APAC conferences, we see it on display. There's no doubt that it plays a role. When I served in the White House, the first job I had was working on what was called democracy promotion, and ended up really working on Cuba, of all places. And I'll always remember the first meeting, the first time I think I met the president in anything more than just shaking his hand, was about the Cuban embargo. And the president had his cabinet, or many members of his cabinet around the room, and I was there as a note taker. And I was asking people, do you think we should lift the embargo? On the substance, everyone agreed. The embargo was counterproductive, it didn't help us. And somebody asked, I think it was Secretary Rubin, Secretary of the Treasury at the time, said, well, why don't we do something about it? And the president's political advisor said, it's because of the background noise. If you lift the embargo, that's not going to liberate Cuba tomorrow. In the meantime, we're going to have to deal with the background noise, the fact that members of Congress and the media and others are going to keep raising this issue. It's going to hurt us on other things. So only do it if you really think that you're going to get something out of it. Otherwise, there's a cost. And it's not that they can veto what we're going to do. It's that it's an encumbrance. I could think of countless examples of things that I did mistakenly because I was a novice. And another example, I wrote a speech for the National Security Advisor in which I had said, I had the words that the proximity between Israelis and Palestinians was both a blessing and a curse. I said that it was a curse because of the line, because they couldn't, they made the conflict all the more visceral, but a blessing in that it forced them to come to terms with each other and to try to find a way out. I kid you not, I think the next 24 hours were devoted, not just my time, the National Security Advisor's time, in trying to fend off criticism by members of some Jewish organizations saying that by saying that, the National Security Advisor had said that terrorism was a blessing. And it was a full day, constant phone calls, and in the end we lost. But that's the point, is that if a president doesn't see a real benefit, if he doesn't see something that he's going to get out of it, then yes, he's obviously going to take into account what are the domestic repercussions, and AIPAC and others are just doing a better job at what they're doing than others do. J Street or others do. They're just more effective, they're older, they have more money, they have more power. They're doing everything that they should be doing if one believes in what they believe in. It's nothing illegitimate, it's nothing dark. The question, for me, it's always, if there's a policy that the president can defend on national security grounds and that he actually sees success, if tomorrow he were to put a peace plan on the table and he believed this peace plan is actually going to succeed, and I don't care what groups say about it, interest groups say about it, lobbying groups say about it, he'll do it. And it's happened with weapons sales to Saudi Arabia over the objection of AIPAC and others. Those things can happen. But when the president did it this time, on 2 occasions, when he called for a full settlement freeze, and when he put his 1967 borders idea on the table, in both cases, what he got in exchange was zero. I mean, he really didn't move the ball that forward. And he got a volley of attacks. So that's what I mean, that he learned his lesson. Politics is not a game of charity. There are costs for what you do, and it's a cost-benefit analysis. In this case, he called for a full settlement freeze. He didn't have the political backing in Israel, let alone in the U.S., to not even with the Israeli left, by the way, to make it happen. He started coming under attack by everyone. It wasn't going to produce what he wanted to produce anyway. It wasn't going to produce a fair settlement. He gave it up. Same with when he gave a speech afterwards. So that's, I think there's obviously it's a much more complex issue. We can talk about how they exercise an influence, but it's one of the other myths I think that I hear sometimes Arab and Palestinians. They say what we have to do is defeat the Israel lobby, and then we'll have the Americans where we want to. I don't know what it means to defeat them. The tie between the U.S. and Israel is such that they're not going to be overcome. Whatever president you have, whatever balance of power you have in the country, that is not a hope that people should entertain either. However much I welcome the greater pluralism of voices among Jews, and in particular the rise of J Street, I think it's a healthy thing that people could speak much more openly and freely than they could 10, 15 years ago. I think that's a very healthy sign of things to come. I don't think that it's a game changer in terms of U.S. policy.
Charles Crowley, Kennedy School. The corrosive element in all of this is the continued occupation, undermining Israel's credibility day by day. If a hardliner, like Ariel Sharon attracted his attention to the West Bank, not only began thinking about it, but began making plans for it, implement it before he started to Why can't this idea be rekindled, even though it's infinitely more complicated in Gaza, the mere impulse to get rid of the occupation and withdraw from the West Bank could be a beneficial element, seems to me.
Well, I mean, as I said in my second scenario, I don't exclude that at some point Israel will come back to it. And there are many Israelis I've talked to who say that ultimately they think that's the way out. And by the way, that's not a solution. I mean, what Sharon had in mind was a unilateral step, and it was critical that it be unilateral because if he tried to negotiate a withdrawal from Gaza, I think you know this better than I, we would still be talking about it because each side would be injecting what it wants. What would have to happen is that Israel decides tomorrow we're going to withdraw from X% of the West Bank, but it's not going to be something the Palestinians are going to be applauding or cheering because the security presence will remain, because it won't be withdrawal from all of the West Bank, etc., etc. You can imagine what it would look like. It's not going to give rise to a state on the other side of the Israeli border. But I don't exclude that it will happen. I think the reason why politically now it's difficult is because of the experiences of Gaza and South Lebanon, which do weigh heavily on Israelis. I think they misinterpret those two episodes to some extent, but nonetheless, in the popular psyche, it's very hard today to speak about a unilateral withdrawal from the West Bank when people think, well, if missiles, it's one thing for missiles to be in Gaza, it's another thing for missiles to be in South Lebanon, it's a third thing altogether if they were only a few miles away from the very heartland industrial heartland of Israel, if you had rockets in Ramallah and elsewhere. So I think that's what's hard to overcome, but I think if we remain in this standstill for some time, I would predict that the idea would come back to the fore.
Hi, I'm Susan Plexi, I'm a mediator. Thank you very much for an incredibly comprehensive analysis of the conflict. I think the article that was sent around was one of the best that I've seen. I agree with you that part of the reason for a lack of settlement is because the genesis issues haven't been looked at. And with that in mind, I'm wondering your thoughts about the religion component of it, particularly with regard to the Temple Mount Carmel chart. It seems to me that the parties get constructed as the secular nationalists, with the spoilers being Islamists and settlers, or the religious Jews. And it seems that that construct just contributes to the lack of imagination that's keeping things stuck.
I think that you stated it the way I would. I mean, I think that's right. I think it has been a bias in terms of who we, and this is a bias that U.S. policymakers have in general, which is you talk to those who most parrot what you say and who most look like what you want them to look like. And that's not only true of Israelis and Palestinians, it's true throughout the region, and it explains, I think, many fiascos, because not only do you talk to them, but you then believe that they're the true representatives of the people who you want to deal with. And so when you talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in general and the religious component, and this is something that Crisis Group, one of our future reports, is going to be looking precisely at what the religious right in Israel, what are its interests. Now, some of those interests you're not going to be able to accommodate to the extent that they want all of mandatory historic Palestine. That's not something that's consistent with a negotiated solution. But there may be something that they care about deeply in terms of their attachment to the land, in terms of some of the religious sites. Maybe we could think about differently, and maybe you could also have the same on the Palestinian side. I've been a member of a number of Track 2 exercises where Israelis and Palestinians come together, and years ago what was really enlightening to me was the Track 2 between the religious right, settlers, and Palestinian, I don't want to call them hardline, but certainly not left, most open-minded. They found it so much more positive and rewarding than Palestinians was telling me than when they met with the Israeli left, because they felt that they were dealing with people they didn't know if they really believed what they said, they didn't believe that they believed the same thing they did. They were much more comfortable talking to people who said, yes, we care about the land, all the land. We really believe in it. We love this land and we want to have it. Palestinians felt these are sincere people who truly believe what they say. Let's see if we can get somewhere. They didn't get anywhere in the end. It was just Track 2 and it failed. But they did feel that there was something different about talking to people who didn't look at it simply as a technical exercise, and who didn't say, for example, and this is one thing that I was said earlier, the point about demographic threat, they didn't speak about, you there, us here, we want to get rid of the Palestinians, we don't want to see you. Ehud Barak said that this is like a divorce, it's separation, we're not really dealing with, it's not We're not looking for an agreement that's going to bring us together. We're looking for an agreement in which they'll be there and we'll be here, which is not always the way the Israeli right has looked at it. Now, they've looked at it sometimes as one state and as a second-class citizenry and a first-class citizenry. But there may be more to it than that. And then maybe, again, I don't want to sound naive in thinking that suddenly you're going to bring the right wing on both sides and they're going to reach an agreement. But I think we make a mistake by neglecting that segment, which, as I said, is the one that could do most to torpedo whatever you do because they're the most mobilized. We know it in our own politics. You don't need a majority numerically to be the most influential. You need a majority, that's the word, in terms of your political weight, in terms of the passion of your beliefs, in terms of your motivation, your ability to get people out on the street.
Thank you. My name is Robert Malley, student and verified student from Rama.
Very right.
I mean, you have discussed briefly the applications of the Arab Spring, but considering the popularity among Islamist parties in the region, Middle East and North Africa, do you think that Hamas would be assisted to play the new leadership role for the Palestinians to work out a solution?
I don't know that Hamas, I mean, my assessment, but so many people have been wrong about so many elections and popularity contests in the region that I don't want to venture too far, but I don't know that they represent today a majority of Palestinians. What I do think, and I made this point in an article recently, that at some level, what I'm talked about in terms of unilateral withdrawal in response to an earlier question, there is some congruence, at least objectively, between what Hamas says it wants and what the Israeli right wing says it wants, although there's a big divergence as to the practicalities. I think when Israelis say, we can withdraw from some territory, but we can't resolve the conflict. We can't reach an end of the conflict solution because we can't give the right of return and we can't accept some of the other Palestinian positions. Hamas's position for a hudna, for a ceasefire, for calm, whatever you want to call it, an armistice, it would be this. Now they say, we can't solve this issue either. We know we can't solve it because at the bottom we're never going to recognize the legitimacy of the state of Israel. But we could coexist. We will be in our place and we'll do what we have to do, and you'll be in your place and you do what you have to do. Now, as I said, the definitions of what that interim period of armistice is the respective definitions are very different, and that probably just much more difficult to resolve than I could even hint at in an answer. But there may be a role for Hamas to play in that respect as an organization that will say, let's recognize that we can't resolve the 1948 issues. Let's not pretend we have and say it's the end of conflict, but let's reach an intermediary stage of coexistence. And then, as Hamas leaders will tell anyone, after one generation, 2 generations, maybe we'll find different ways of coexisting, maybe in one state, maybe not. And when you look at the evolution of Hamas recently, and in particular the role that the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood is playing, and the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood is in a position now where what it appears to be wanting to do more than anything is to gain legitimacy worldwide, which means they don't want to appear too radical, too militant. They don't want to be at the forefront of the Palestinian struggle. If anything, they're counseling Hamas to be more pragmatic. You may have at some point a situation where Hamas does basically what Fatah did some decades ago and transitions gradually towards the acceptance of the two-state reality with coexistence, and they're not, I would say they're there already, but they would have to sort of dilute their position even more. I don't exclude it, but I think the Palestinian political field is extremely, is in great flux, and I think today we can't really say, we don't know when President Abbas is no longer president, what will happen to Fatah, what will happen to that camp. Hamas is in the midst of its, I think, its most serious crisis since its creation, with more vocal criticism of one side against the other, in large part because of what's happening in the rest of the Arab world. So I think there's no predicting where things will be a year or 2 from now. I suspect that the Arab field, the Palestinian field, is going to look very different from the one it looks like today.
Exactly one direct attendees.
You have just enough reason to be fired.
But I wanted you to speak a bit more about the regional situation. But to come back to what you said, I mean, I agree with you that the stars are very aligned. But one dimension of that alignment is balance of power. And basically the Israelis have not had the interest to settle. At least they haven't been pushed into it. So lobby groups have always managed to, stop change, I agree with you, the status quo is sustainable for a while until maybe too much of the West Bank is colonized and something will happen as a reaction to that. But the other possibility is this Arab Spring will actually bring something new, maybe not in the short term, but in the medium term, in the sense that the unease in the region will get reflected in a balancing of power. It can be done in various ways. I mean, one question is, the Egyptian next government, what is the brotherhood or someone else, they'll have competition from the Salafis, and they'll have pressure to open up the Gaza border. Stuff will happen there. I don't know what will happen in Syria, but there's some likelihood in a year or 2 or 3 that regime will change, and the whole situation in the Golan Heights would be up for grabs again. The Iranian situation is quite fluid with Hezbollah in the south, the Arab plan is still there. So I imagine that it may be that nothing will change and indeed will continue with the status quo. But I will watch the regional situation more in terms of possibilities of changing the balance of power.
Well, I mean, let me start where you started, and it's a point I was trying to make. I think right now, part of the reason why the status quo is perpetuating itself is that there is what I called earlier this addiction to the status quo by elites in virtually every way. For Israel, clearly the status quo, as I was saying at this point, is very comfortable. And we could go through the reasons why. I don't need to elaborate. For the Palestinian Authority elite, they also are benefits. They have relatively comfortable lives. They have VIPs to be able to move. Economically, some segments have done okay because they're getting assistance from outside. So, there's a lot to lose, and that's why when there's been all this discussion, should the Palestinian Authority disband itself? Should President Abbas be much more confrontational at the UN? Should there be more popular resistance? There's always a fear, what will the retaliation be of those who are acting against? Which, of course, if that's not part of the calculation, then you can't, or if that's what's going to stop you from moving, then you'll never move. Because by definition, if you're going to do something against your enemy will do something in return. But as long as they are caught into this web of relationships and networks, hard for them to move. The Europeans have also been addicted. They feel they have a role by bankrolling the Palestinian Authority, having a seat at the table, and that's also perpetuated status quo. The U.S., the simple notion of having a peace process that it is leading has been good for its image and for its posture in the Middle East. It's been one of these balancing factors that's allowed it to say, well, yes, we're close to Israel, but we also are promoting the peace process, etc., etc. I think there's been enough, people have enough of a stake in perpetuating what is, I think, clear to most people is simply an illusory status quo and peace process that it's been continued. Now, something has to give, as you said. What could give? Now, what will change it could be a mix of new incentives and new disincentives. You're focusing, I assume, when you look at the Arab world, is what could happen in the Arab world that's going to change Israel's calculation. In the long run, or the medium term, you may be right. My suspicion in the short term is, on the contrary, as I said, Israelis are going to say, this is precisely why we shouldn't take any risks. Now, later, and by the way, I think right now the message from the Arab world is not so much we're focusing on Israel, we're focusing on our own affairs and the Muslim Brotherhood first and foremost. If anything, they seem to care less. And the situation in Gaza today, maybe not today because they just reached an agreement, but yesterday, was worse than it was under the worst days of Mubarak because the Egyptians have had, because of the inability to reach an agreement on the provision of petrol and other goods. And the Muslim Brotherhood hasn't said much about it. Which is really an indication for those Palestinians who are counting on them that they have their own bread to butter first, and they have their own interests to take care of first. Over time, it could be one of those game changers. You may have greater militancy from Arab governments that are going to have to be much more representative of their public opinions. So if those public opinions focus on the Palestinian question, that could change. I think that's very true, and I think that's something that Israeli policymakers have in the back of their mind, but in the back of their minds, in front of their minds is still the notion that right now, too uncertain, too risky, they're thinking about their own affairs, we shouldn't do anything. But I think you're right. I think what happens in Egypt is obviously the most important in this respect. What happens in Egypt is going to be critical. I suspect it's going to be several years before we know. If something were to happen in Jordan, that would be an equally significant game changer.
I wanted to just use my prerogative again to ask a question, which is speaking on this question of unsustainability or sustainability. what struck me, there were many people who were in this room came on the Palestine track. They took them to the West Bank. And it actually felt that on the ground, while I agree with you on the level of the Palestinian Authority when it comes to Israel, it feels quite sustainable. It felt, at least to me, that it was rather unsustainable when it came to the situation on the ground, whether it was in Hebron or in Wallaj where the wall was being built, or in Nabi Saleh, all these various areas. And coupled with that, I also feel that now there's a much more active Palestinian diaspora that's becoming much more vocal to the extent that the Palestinian Authority's ability to govern is actually being questioned, and there are more increased calls to either change the PLO or disband the PLO. Do you see any role for the Palestinian diaspora? And do you feel that the situation on the ground for Palestinians is sustainable? What would change that or make it unsustainable?
Again, I never know what the tipping point is, sustainability and sustainability. I think many people had thought, sort of the dog that hasn't barked, the Palestinian Arab Spring, which hasn't really occurred. People were thinking Palestinians who historically have always been at the vanguard, not always, but for decades at the vanguard of the Arab national movement. For once, they seem to be, passive spectators. And if one thing would really change the situation in response to the previous question and to yours, if the Palestinians could truly organize nonviolent popular resistance at this time, query what would Israel's reaction be, and what would America's reaction be to Israel's reaction at a time when it is saying that passive popular nonviolent resistance is exactly what it's calling for throughout the world. So if it could be done now, I think it would have a major impact. I wasn't there as recently as you, so I can't judge whether it's on the verge of happening. I don't see the signs, but these things happen often. In hindsight, it's one event that was the trigger event, and people didn't see it coming before, and then afterwards it looks like it was preordained. But so I don't know how sustainable or not, and I don't know if the unsustainability could be cured through sort of financial gimmicks and other ways to sort of keep the lid on the satisfaction. And how heavily does the second intifada weigh on people's minds? Do they want to go through that again? The fact that they have a divided leadership and weak leaderships on both ends. I mean, Hamas, both Hamas and Fatah now are. I think Hamas is with respect, my sense is they're not doing particularly well. I think both Fatah has failed in what it says it does best, negotiations, and Hamas has failed in what it says it does best, resistance. And Hamas is replicating in Gaza many of the things it once saw in the West Bank. So I don't know that either one of them today has the capacity to mobilize. They have not just the capacity, but sometimes the incentive to prevent others from mobilizing. So there's a lot of, between Israel, the PA, and Hamas, there are a lot of parties that probably don't want to see the kind of movement in Palestine that you're describing. So I don't know whether we're going to see that happen. Now, as for the diaspora, I've heard this now for some time from some of my friends in the diaspora, that as a function of the growing weakness of the inside, because the West Bank basically is becoming, seen from the outside, it's been ineffective, it's too content with the status quo. That may be the wrong way to look at that. Gaza is sort of on its own. The diaspora, relatively speaking, is going to gain more influence. I think certainly they are more vocal today than they were in the past. They seem to be setting the agenda, particularly on the question of one state, on BDS, much more than they have in the past. And they're a majority of Palestinians. I mean, it's very hard not to take that into account. Do they have the ability to organizationally to truly weigh on the direction of the Palestinian movement? I mean, I'm sure you're a better place than I am to see that. I haven't seen evidence if PLO is truly restructured, if there really are democratic elections or some form of both a rejuvenation of the PLO and reconstitution of its membership through elections in the diaspora, which is going to be hard to do in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, just like three countries, then yes, I think it could make a difference. But I've been told this by members of the diaspora for years. Let's not forget that in the 70s it was the diaspora that was leading the charge. Could we come back to those days? I don't exclude it, but I think, as I said earlier, I think the entire Palestinian field is up for grabs. Nobody today can claim to speak for the Palestinians. Nobody has charted a vision that seems to be capturing Palestinians. Now it seems to be the time when, because of the vacuum, because of the uncertainty, because of the frustration, some organization can do it, but I see too much division and too many different interests between the West Bank, and not just the West Bank, you have to sort of call it as one, between Northern and Southern, Jerusalemites, Gaza, diaspora, different fractions of that diaspora. I think it's going to be a very tall order, but we'll have to see.
There's one more question, yes.
My name is Matt Lewis. I'm a national security fellow, and looking at the situation not on the tactical issues that are on the ground right now, but on strategic issues. And I think the gentleman's question earlier. Is there a strategic opportunity with the common interest or concerns of Iranian influence, like from Iran, that may capture the Arab Spring as an Islamist Spring? There's obviously concerns about a nuclear armed Iran that are shared between both Israel and the GCC countries. So is there a strategic opportunity in that common interest that exists between the GCC countries and Israel that would cause Israel to reach out to the GCC and adopt something that resembles the Arab Peace Plan of 2002 that would do three things? That the strategic answer would help repair the relationship with Turkey, that it would find a final two-state solution agreeable with the Arab states that are around them, and three, strengthen the region against Iran from ever trying to flex its muscle in that militant Shia force. Is there a common interest that might provide that strategic opportunity?
On paper, yes. In reality, no. I mean, in this sense, I think there is a convergence of interest. And if you go to the speech of Gulf leaders, it's quite remarkable how open they are in locally calling for an Israeli strike on Iran. Go to Qatar, go to UAE, Saudi Arabia, that's what they want. I find it perplexing at some level because I think it's not going to be in their interest, but let them be the judge of that. But I don't think that translates into Israeli Gulf Arab convergence on what to do with the Palestinians. That was part of the question for two reasons. Number one, I think the Israelis are persuaded, and they have every reason to be persuaded, that the Gulf countries are going to have that attitude no matter what. They're not doing it to please Israel. They don't need Israel to convince them of the Iranian threat. If anything, they're more convinced than the Israelis are of how strong the Iranian threat is because they're in their neighborhood and because of their whole vision of Sunni versus Shiite. So I think Israel doesn't view that it has to pay a price for actions by Gulf Arab countries that they would take in any event for their own interest. And incidentally, these Gulf Arab countries almost never raise the Palestinian issue with their foreign interlocutors. I mean, how many Americans do I know come back and say, nobody cares about the Palestinian issue. I was just in Riyadh and in Doha and in Dubai, and it was raised perfunctorily at the very end because I mentioned it. So it's not as if they're pushing for that. For that. So it was the same, when people started at the beginning, the way Obama will convince Netanyahu about Iran, about the Palestinians, is to say, you need to move on the Palestinians, that way I'll be able to move on Iran. I think Netanyahu reached his own conclusion that the president has his own political and strategic calculations versus Iran. He doesn't have to pay in a currency that he thinks is not in his interest because the U.S. is going to move in that direction anyway. So I see those. I've always seen those conflicts as being very detached. And as I said earlier in response to Diana's question, I don't think that a war between Israel and the United States, or a combination of the two against Iran, is going to fundamentally affect that. There is a convergence of interest when it comes on the Iranian question. There's a divergence of interest when it comes to the Palestinian one, but at this point, I'm not the only one. I mean, Washington is not the only case where there's little interest in the Palestinian question. It's perhaps even less interest in it when it comes to Gulf Arab countries. So, unfortunately, I think that strategic interest may result in a war on Iran, but not peace with the Palestinians.
Well, thank you very much, Rob, for coming.